If you could take a moment and go to thegrowingbanddirector.com to give at least $5 or $3 a month, and it helps the content continue to be created for you to help our profession grow. Let's go back to our scheduled episode. I want to thank Austin Custom Brass for being a sponsor of today's podcast. Trent Austin started this wonderful shop back in the Boston area many years ago and has moved to Kansas City. Check out their unique line of doublers instruments that are perfect for students, band programs, and players of all ages. The Austin Custom Brass Doublers Flugelhorn is their most popular selling instrument, available in 5 different beautiful finishes. These flugelhorns come with a case in Austin Custom Brass's Fab 5 mouthpiece. The Doublers Flugelhorn offers a quality sound, playability, and affordability. Get one for yourself or your whole trumpet section today. Call Austin Custom Brass at 816-410-0826. They are located in Kansas City, Missouri, but they ship all over the country, and they're wonderful humans and great people to hang with. Austin Custom Brass works with band programs from all over the country. They can provide a bid to you today, work within your school's budget, and accept POs. Call their team today at 816-410-0826 or email at info@austincustombrass.com. Excelsior Music Publishing is proud to sponsor the Growing Band Director podcast. Excelsior Music Publishing provides new music for concert band, jazz ensemble, solo and ensemble, and books for all levels and occasions, including a specially curated and robust selection of music for your contest and festival performances. A variety of overtures, marches, and lyric works included on numerous state lists await. Select music that's perfect for your contest and festival needs at excelsiormusic.com. That's EXCELCIA music.com. Welcome back to the Growing Band Director podcast. This is episode number 241 here at Jazz at Lincoln Center with Tatum Greenblatt. All right. Good. Thanks. Thanks for having me. And Julia Salentino. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being my host and my chauffeur and my meal preparer. Just a big thank you to Larry Clark and Excelsior Music for sponsoring my trip down here. So the two of you just heard your bands perform while we were eating. So I heard your band through the door. Okay. Killing bands. You guys do the top 2 bands here at the Youth
High School Jazz Academy
at Jazz Lincoln Center. And I wanted to kind of touch into that conversation you both were having right afterward about how the rhythm section has to act differently during the solo section of the big band chart.
Yeah. Well, it's not that they have to act differently. It's that they need to not act differently, really. I feel like what we see a lot, and Julius and I both do a lot of workshops with a lot of bands. We get to cover a wide range of abilities with students of this age group. It seems to be a reflex that young rhythm sections have where their dynamic level is directly related to the number of horn players playing in a big band. So you can get them to play loud in a shout chorus, but the second a soloist comes in, there's this reflex to adjust and play quiet because the soloist. And I think a lot of young bands and people who direct young bands recognize this. It's like everything can be hit, and then there's this like automatic piano that happens. And the thing is what happens in that situation is that all the momentum just gets lost, unless it's actually arranged in the chart, like you're playing a Count Basie tune and it's supposed to have this immediate dynamic shift. A lot of times, there's a part in the arrangement of the band will be a send-off to the soloist, and the soloist is supposed to feed off that energy and to continue, and the rhythm section needs to keep pumping along. And if anything, needs to step up a level to make up for the fact that the band is no longer there. So the thing that we were talking about just now was with one of the drummers from Julius's band did exactly what he was supposed to do, which was just keep the momentum going. And you can feel it's such a tangible difference that you feel in the audience as an audience member, because the music keeps moving forward. It keeps having that momentum. I think as like a thing that always works, it's really important for all young musicians to know, especially young rhythm section musicians, is the importance of keeping the dynamics and the momentum of the piece going, regardless of who's playing at the time. And I think that there's always a context to tell the band what the dynamics are, but it shouldn't be a reflex as to, now we're in the solo section, so let's get quiet. Mm-hmm. A lot of times what also happens at that point with young bands is that then the tempo starts to sag a little bit, because dynamics and tempos seem to be related from time to time.
At what point, because sometimes you want the solo section to then start and then build, right?
True.
So at what point can you do that? Is it like they have to be experienced enough?
Well, it depends on what the chart calls for, and I think that's one of our responsibilities in the position of band directors is to know enough about the specifics of arranging and orchestration to really understand what the chart is asking for. That also tells us a lot about, who has the lead melody, or why is this part important to play louder than that part? That there's a lot of contextual information that comes from understanding the technique of the arranger and the orchestration itself, or the flow of the tune. And the more that we can be in tune with that, sort of from a composer arranger standpoint, at least just understanding how it works, the more that tells us about the specific context of the solo, right? Because if you're playing bassy, the solos are supposed to have these very sharp dynamic shifts. The band's roaring, right? But if you do that on a Bill Holman tune, it might be completely out of context because he might have written something that's supposed to just keep going. It really depends on the arranger. And we do that in Maria Schneider's music. It gets out, like her stuff has this really beautiful flow to it. It's not about these massive dynamic shifts in the same way the bassy stuff really is. So we need to have, it's part of our responsibility as band directors to have that understanding of music. And even if it's just an understanding of why does this chart look the way it does? How is it supposed to sound? How do these dynamics play in? What is the ebb and flow of the music? Then that helps us be able to convey to the rhythm section and to the horn players what their responsibilities are at any given time.
Definitely, just to add to that, the rhythm section is definitely in a tricky spot because you're thinking about the big band, playing behind a big band, and then a lot of times you're almost thinking like combo, playing in a big band. So it's definitely a different mindset of the rhythm section forward and think of it as. Also, as a soloist, depending on backgrounds are just jumping on what Tatum says, it's all relative. It's how you build it up. Being a soloist in the big band, you usually don't have really that much time to build. Playing a solo in the big band is very different. So you got your short amount of courses to make a statement. So there's a great tradition, the big band tradition of soloists kind of working things out. And Jack used to say, you play good solo, that's part of the song. People would think that was part of the song. Your solo came up, so flying home, commentating. Those moments become part of the arrangement. So, keeping that fresh too, if you're coming with that kind of segment section, almost not telegraph what's going to happen because they already know the solo. Sometimes, it's like a classic solo played at many times. So things like that. So it's definitely a different dynamic. It's a rhythm section. And it's a soloist.
Another thing that we hit on a lot when we recorded earlier today was making sure you know the history of the tune. Right. So whatever arrangement you're doing, assuming there is a history of the tune, that it's not Timmy's Tacos or whatever was written yesterday, but that you've listened to those recordings and then you can make adjustments based on those.
Yeah.
So we have our mentors, people that we've listened to, or people that have helped, us be raised up as a band director. I've heard a lot about your dad as a jazz educator.
Yeah.
Can you tell the audience about him if they don't know him?
Sure.
And what? It's almost hard to say what have you taken from him, right? Because he's your dad and he's an educator and all that. But
my father, his name is Dan Greenblatt. He's a tenor saxophone player and mostly does private instruction stuff, and it was in the Seattle area. He was in New York for a while, back to Seattle. What I learned from him was much more about the process of learning how to improvise and also the process of learning how to teach improvisation. This whole philosophy of he comes at jazz is a language from his other major study, which is that he has a PhD in linguistics. So when he talks about jazz as language, he can actually know the language part of it. Whereas a lot of musicians, no disrespect at all, I use the metaphor all the time. We're not as well versed in the actual specifics of language acquisition and all that kind of stuff. And I learned a lot from him about that. I do have to give credit for, as a band director, the people that I really learned the most from. I was incredibly fortunate to grow up in Seattle at a time when we were overflowing with amazing directors. My first director, I was in a band when I was in 5th grade, and my director was Scott Brown, who's been the guru in Roosevelt High School in Seattle for 30 years. I then went from that band into my own middle school band, which was directed by Robert Natt, who was arguably the greatest middle school band director in the history of time. And then I went from that band into 4 years under the direction of Clarence Acox, who's one of the legendary high school bands. And then outside of that, I got to study with, Roy Cummings at the University of Washington. I was incredibly fortunate to have great mentors and people who I didn't even realize at the time that I was learning from. I was just soaking up what they were saying. And then I realized when I got a chance to get in front of a band, I would just spew what they had said. But that's how you're supposed to learn how to do stuff. It's just copy from the best.
As you think back to those 3 directors you mentioned, do you remember what specifically, like when I think of my high school band director, I think he worked really hard and he was really persistent. And that's one of the things that I took from him. So like what, as you kind of think back to that time?
With Scott Brown, there was an element of seriousness and just like a respect in the band room. That was the thing that I always got around him, which is not to say that anybody else was disrespectful, but there was this aura of like, it almost, not that I ever served in the military, so I don't know what I'm talking about, but it sort of felt like that kind of tight ship thing of like, we are here to pay attention and do the job. And then his knowledge of the music was so incredibly deep that everything that he would tell us would work. And so if you just like listened and followed directions and did what he told you to do, you would get better fast. And it was similar with Robert Nat. His thing that was so important that I really have tried to embody as a band director is that there is no such thing as an age level for the music. If you can bring people to the music and make them good enough to play it. We were in 7th grade playing actual Count Basie charts. We were playing like the real deal charts as a 13 and 14-year-olds. And granted, we had an absurd level of musicianship in our band, but he would make us take the music extraordinarily seriously, and he would not let us ever get out over our skis with we would never take a tune too fast that we couldn't play it. I remember 7th grade, we played an arrangement of Tico Tico. We never performed it because we never got it good enough. He would never let us go out there and sound haphazard in any way. But we rehearsed it almost every day, and it was so mind-numbingly slow when we would rehearse it because that's how fast we could play it correctly. He would always make us drill it and get it right. Just not let us get away with making mistakes. And he had like 15, 20 years of bands, just like absolutely. You would listen, if you did a blindfold test, you'd be like, what's this college level group? And then you realize that they're just still a bunch of kids. And then with Clarence Acox, he was his force of personality, his joy for the music, his knowledge of the music. When I was in the band, he was basically dealing with the professional level group. And so he had a charisma and a leadership aura about him that was just so infectious and gave you this confidence in the music. And he always picked incredible charts. He put together great sets and really knew a lot about just kind of like, almost like think about Cap Calloway, just like this charisma of leadership. He had that thing where you're just like, man, Acox, like, yeah, and he gave a pride to the band. Like we really we were Garfield, serious about it. So I get more and more grateful with every time I step in front of a band, I have the opportunity to work with young people. I think back more and more to just the experiences I had, especially with those 3 men. And it's I didn't even realize at the time how life-changing it was. I'm just very fortunate to have gotten to work with them.
I think even more and more because like the example that we all set for the kids that are in our band.
Yeah.
Like we don't have to try to be somebody we're not. Right? Like you respect your directors for what they brought to you. I think Dr. Tim says people will follow you if you bring a good benefit to their life. And clearly good directors do that. So yeah, like it's not a pressure on us, but like just know the impact you're having, either good or bad, to the people within your care.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I know we wanted to talk about how playing in a big band prepares kids to be productive members of society.
Yes.
Right? We were kind of talking ahead of time about that. So what do you mean by that? What rabbit hole are we going down?
First, you must listen.
Love.
Right? The best lesson that you will ever get from playing in any group of any size in this music is that your first responsibility is to listen. That, I think, will take you through life well. Beyond that...
2 ears, 1 mouth. Right, have you heard that one?
Yeah, exactly. Or to quote Gypsy, open your eyes instead of your mouth. Although this one, open your ears, right? I don't think it gets enough credit, just the amount of dedication, concentration, time, and development of skill that it takes to operate an instrument in a jazz setting. It is extraordinarily difficult. Classical music gets everybody respects the process of learning how to play classical music, as they should. Classical music is extraordinarily difficult to learn how to play, high levels of technique, an incredible legendary pantheon of music. We have the exact same thing in our music, in American classical music, which we call jazz. And it is just as difficult to play that music. It is just as difficult to play Ellington as it is to play Bach. The difference is it's even harder to play Ellington because you might have to take a solo. Mm-hmm. And for all the improvisation that Bach did in his time, he didn't make his musicians do it. We don't make the musicians do it now. You don't have to get up there and play a solo in Baroque. But you do have to get up there in a jazz band and be able to play a solo in bebop or funk or early jazz, or to know these styles. So the level of skill development that you have to get to play an instrument at an appropriate level to deal with this music is extraordinary. Probably for most of our students, they're not going to have to work that hard to excel in any other class that they take, right? Unless they're doing like AP Calc, like that's the level. The jazz band is an AP class. So you got to be able to listen. You really got to be able to practice, have responsibility. You start, the thing about practicing is that you learn the benefit of time put in to develop it. That's a really important life skill, to be able to sit there and go like, I might not be good at this yet, but I will be. And I've learned that practicing is beneficial to my being. Whatever you're trying to do. I mean, making a pasta sauce, man, you're not going to get it right.
And the other part of that is too, you're practicing the trumpet, but there's also practicing jazz, but you have to be able to trumpet before you can play jazz.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's that. The learning of improvisation forces us to come to terms with history, to pay attention to what's come before us, to learn from that, to have reverence for people who, to put it plainly, are not the type of people to get reverence from American culture these days. We have a bunch of masters in our music who dealt with extraordinary adverse situations in their lives. But for their genius within this music might be thrown under the rug in terms of their recognition, on a national scale. But here we are telling our young people that Charlie Parker is somebody that they need to know about for all of these wonderful reasons. Dizzy Gillespie is someone they need to know about. That on and on and on the list goes, right? The importance of history. The thing about learning how to improvise is it is the same process as learning a second language. So as important as it is for our students to take a second language in high school, it should be just important for them to learn how to improvise, right? All of those things, the benefits of that process go way beyond just the band, right? The thing about listening, learning how to play in a band helps you learn how to be a part of a team. It helps you learn how to understand the role of leadership and the role of being led. Two things that, give me anybody in the business world that doesn't want someone that can lead a team meeting and also be in a team meeting and understand what they're supposed to do, right? I had one of my dad's first students was somebody that was in the process of his midlife crisis, was going back to tenor saxophone during his career as a brain surgeon. And he said that trying to learn how to improvise was infinitely harder than learning brain surgery. Because at the end of the day, brain surgery was just rote memorization. If you learned all of the steps, you could repeat the steps. And pretty much anything that you could figure out, like, okay, I need to do this, so that's going to be X, Y, Z, 1, 2, 3, A, B, C. But life makes us improvise. You have to be able to roll with punches. Things are going to come at you that you don't know how to, that you're not prepared for. And if you gain the confidence within the musical setting of, I gotta play now. I'm the leader. I got to deal with this. I got to make this up. It gives you confidence and an understanding of how to be able to improvise through life, which is a huge skill set. You're going to get thrown challenges, whether they be in the business world or the educational world or just in your life. I think that's a really important skill set to develop. And so for me, it's like that we give a lot of import to being on a sports team. And I think that's well deserved. We learn a lot from being a part of something greater than ourselves. We learn a lot from the process of growing as a group. We learn a lot from the process of having a defined role and all that stuff. No one looks at playing basketball and says that's a waste of your time. In high school, there's a lot of great skill sets. Music has the same thing, plus this other level of intellect and creativity and, personal ownership of yourself and your space. I saw a TED Talk where they were talking about there's like 2 activities that use the entirety of the brain at any given time, at the time of that activity. And they're creative writing and musical improvisation. Creative writing is a great thing, but you don't do that in a group, right? So
in real time,
recorded. But there's that moment of being a part of the creativity as it happens, and it makes your whole brain work at the same time. And improvising in a jazz setting is the other thing that does that. And you're with other people. You're developing community and camaraderie and the social situation, and you're not on your phone, and like you're paying attention and you're interacting. So I just think that all of the things that we ask of our students to excel at in a jazz band setting are going to help them excel with those same skills they get out of school, regardless of if they become a musician. Yeah. We're not training the next generation of musicians. We're training the next generation of people.
I find that sacrifice is it's kind of like a listening thing, but like you sacrifice yourself for the group.
Yeah.
And that's part of the culture that you build. It's like, it's not about me. It's about us.
Yeah. And then but that there's also that thing, like, especially, you talk about Duke Ellington's music. You might think like, oh, I'm just playing third trombone, but all of a sudden you'll be playing lead within a pep section, and you've been sacrificing yourself for the group the whole time, but now you're in charge. You have to decide what the phrasing is going to be. You're responsible for the cutoffs. You're responsible for being consistent about everything, and
Which finger did Duke Ellington not need?
right.
Like, you're just finger 3 on the left hand. Like,
Yeah.
it's not less important than finger 1.
Exactly. And, and not to knock being a defensive lineman, but you're never going to have to throw the ball if you're playing defensive line. Your job is very clear cut. But in the jazz band, you might be quarterback all of a sudden. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really wonderful skill set that it requires us to learn how to deal with. It's like, no, you got it. What do you have to say about this?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to be able to step up and say something that fits the context of the situation and understands the history of it. You've got to be able to give a valid opinion, a researched opinion on it. Get a point of view on it.
Love that.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Julius?
I mean, I'm just enjoying Tatum's take on this whole thing that we do. Just to hear him being so articulate about it. I was going to ask him to talk, because it's something I still have been, and I'm sure he got from his dad talking about this music as a language is one thing, but I love how Tatum brought it and talking about it as a second.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah. Well, I got that from my dad, and that's that the understanding of language development basically has 2 branches. There's native language acquisition and second language acquisition, or non-native language acquisition. And the metaphor that gets used all the time is that if you imagine a family that moves to a new country and you see, children being able to pick up the language within 6 months and they're fluent without an accent, and the parents never get to it, right? And part of that has to do with some cultural elements. A student goes to school, they're immersed in the language all the time. And so but it also has to do with just the way that our brains are hardwired, right? When we're young and we're a child, it is absolutely necessary for us to be able to learn how to communicate with our tribe, right? That's just part of how our brains are set up. But after a certain point, that usefulness of the learning to communicate gets replaced by the next most important thing, which is the propagation of our species, which is why, 13, 14, like that those things switch,
I live with a 13, 14-year-old.
So there you go, you see it, right? And, so when we understand that process of language development, we can't treat the acquisition of music for most people as native language. Now, there is native language acquisition in music. You see this all the time in people that grow up in musical families or get exposed to it at a young enough age. I recognize that I have native rhythmic language acquisition because I grew up listening to the music, seeing the music, hearing the music. And so when I was 9 and learning how to play the trumpet, and my dad would say, no, swing it. Like, I knew exactly what that meant. It wasn't something that I had to natively learn. It was part of my understanding of music. There was other stuff I had, but that one was native. And so we see it, it's clearly a part of the process. You see people who have native language acquisition. Most of our students that we're going to deal with are coming at the music at the same way that we go to our freshman Spanish class or Chinese class or whatever the second language is that you take in high school. We come at it without the part of our brain that is hardwired to it to bring that information in and make sense of it. So the way that we have to go about learning it musically is the same way that we go about learning that second language linguistically. You start with vocabulary. You need to start with something to say, and you need to learn how to say it with the right accent. Accent is the most common teller of a person's fluency, right? And it's also the most respectful way to show that you've learned a language. If you can speak with the proper pronunciation, the proper accent in a language to someone else who's a native speaker, they're going to go, oh yeah, you got it. We can do this. If you go in and you get the words right, the accent is wrong. Like, you're not speaking the language wrong. So I think that when we approach the process of teaching improvisation and for learning how to improvise for the vast majority of our students, we've got to give them something to say. And this is not a new concept. This is the concept that every great musician in the history of jazz would tell you how they learned up until a point of institutionalization. Right? I mean, I listened to Benny Golson give long master classes where he talked about him and his buddies, Jimmy and John, that would be Heath and Coltrane, just hanging around in one of their parents' living rooms with Charlie Parker on the record, just trying to play what Charlie Parker was playing. So what were they doing? They were learning vocabulary from a native speaker and then try and learn how to say it the right way. And then they would learn the context to say it. It doesn't matter how well you can order a bowl of mushroom soup in French. If you don't do that in a restaurant, you know, can't go to a train station and order a bowl of mushroom soup and add, you know. So the context matters. You got to know when to say it. You got to know how to say it. You got to have something to say. But if you can get those things going, then as the young improviser, you can sit there and go and play something that can connect and you feel it. You know, you can see it in the young musician's face. Like they have a lick and they wait for the right 2/5 and then they play it and it works. And it's like, yeah, you just communicated in this other language. It's so great.
So many kids think that they just have to, when they improvise, it's just going to come, rather than like, these are like learned patterns. Like you have to learn. And then at some point, yes, you will improvise things based on that, but you need to learn something and repeat that over and over again.
Yes.
First. What did Clark Terry say? Can I remember?
Imitation, assimilation, innovation. Yeah. And the time scale for that is different depending on the context of what you have to do. One of the things one of the metaphors I use is that you're giving a speech. And if I don't speak any Japanese, I know 2 phrases in Japanese. Like one of them being, "Where's the toilet?" Right? But if I were to have to go and give a workshop in Japanese, I would be playing a written solo for years, right? I'd be in phonetics trying to work it out for a long time. And if I kept at it and I studied for years and put myself in immersive situations, I might be able to memorize my solo after a couple of years. You know, but it would be 10 years before I could go and give an original thought. Mm-hmm. Yet we will give a blues scale to a 7th grader and say, "Play what you hear." And that's, we're setting them up for failure, because then immediately what the result is discouragement, right? But if you give them a lick and say, "Okay, wait until the 8th bar and then play, now they got language. And at least they know how to say, 'Hi, my name is,'" you know? Mm-hmm. And so that's in terms of the thing that I got from my dad and part of his big teaching method, and how I learned and how all of his students learn, you gotta start with things to say, and you gotta say them right. We can program a computer to play bad swung jazz licks. You know, the vocabulary almost doesn't matter. Like it's how the way in which you say it is equally, if not more important than what you play. We should almost be just teaching them how to swing regardless of notes. Play the chromatic scale and just make it, have the phonetics. Exactly.
So question for both of you. Did you go to school for music ed or performance?
Just performance.
Okay.
Yeah, just performance.
Okay. So this would be, I was thinking about it for you, but it would work for both of you. So like you're taught how to perform and get better, but at some point you got to go like, how do I teach that?
Yeah.
Right. So what was that? I'm wondering if both of you, like, what was that journey like for you? Like I went to music ed and I was like kind of thinking about this throughout, but at one point you go like, great, you're a killer player. Here's this band, teach them, right? There's a lot of people who would fail at that because they don't know how to reach humans. So,
I mean, I think just going through the process, and I was lucky to be able to tutor Jackie Clean. For his students, he wanted us to teach as well, so he has something called something. And he would, use his top students to go teach there. So that was kind of my beginnings. I was one of the few people that got to actually teach next to him at a summer camp that we had. And so I started formulating some of the ideas I use now, being around him and, being able to teach this, just, going through the motions. And as a performer, I don't know, I'm sure it's similar for Tatum. Like for me, when I got the school gig 18 years ago, coming from just a performer experience and not a music ed major, I literally would just sit in the band and just constantly say to them, this doesn't sound right, phrases like this, until I figured out, my own tricks to kind of get them to sound great at a quicker pace. So it's all about efficiency. I was talking about all these legendary band directors that I idolized since I became listened to their bands for years. Ellington used to have a website where you just listen to the recordings or these tapes back in the day. We should bring those archives back, because I would go to the beginning, listen to each one. So I heard Tatum in those bands, being a band director, so they don't have many. But I realized soon enough that efficiency is definitely to get to the students. Like he was saying, his band director he would say things and it would make it right very quickly.
Yeah.
So that's, for me, just having experience doing that over and over. It's like just by praying your horn, You're practicing every day, you're shedding, you got to get better. it's the same thing. You have to have band director chops. You have to try to get it from the band.
I've also started correlating the imitation, assimilation. I can never remember the order. I have to literally write it down when I do it as it being a band director too, because when you start being a teacher, you're like literally copying the band directors you had, the teachers you had, and then you start.
Yeah.
Your heroes, just like you said.
Yeah.
How was that journey for you?
I've enjoyed the process because it hasn't been an institutional learning thing. I mean, like I certainly had non-institutional learning as a musician, as a player, and then a lot of training through college and grad school. When my stuff anything that I've learned as a band director has come from trying, failing, and then just like talking to people who know what they're doing and trying to get tips from it. I mean, I'm incredibly fortunate to have friends and colleagues like Julius, like James Antonucci, like, Lisa Lindy, like Aaron Bush, and John Reynolds, and Chris De Leon, and Scott Brown about stuff. When I first started teaching at Jazz Lincoln Center, in the high school jazz academy, right around that time, Alexa Tarantino was also teaching in the program, and she has an ed degree. And I would go to her and I'd be like, what do I say to a saxophone player to get him to play this tune? She's like, oh, you just do this. Thank you. Okay. So really just, being curious, being hungry for it, and trying to, and being humble about it. Like I loved knowing that I wasn't any good at it and I needed to grow, because it meant that the world was my oyster. I had all these resources. I could just talk to people. And I was like, great, I'm learning so much. It does help a lot to have the experience of having been in the band. You have an empathy for the students, and you can talk about the music on various different levels. And I think you just, you keep working at wanting to get better at it. You never feel satisfied. Like, well, now I know what I'm talking about. Because every band you get is different. One band might have, really strong people here that need to be spoken to a certain way because you can talk to them like you might talk to a professional. And there are other people in the band that are at a different stage in their development. You have to give them more stuff. One thing that my dad would always, one of his mantra things is just to, especially if you're a skilled, well-developed professional who's been studying the music for a long time, you can't take for granted that your students are going to have the same skill set that you have, right? That we have to recognize, as people who have gotten to a level of professionalism as musicians, that we probably had some gifts given to us that are not by our own choice that helped us get there. And that our students might not necessarily have those same gifts. They might not be as talented as we were, right? And they might not be cut out to be a professional. But that doesn't mean that, so that means that like something that, like I've heard this from time to time from so-and-so legendary master comes up and does a master class and starts playing. Like, yeah, you just kind of, you start playing this and then, and then you hear that and then you just kind of do this. And, yeah. And then I heard it. Yeah. You're like, I learned nothing from this. And I'm good. I know what you're talking about, and I still couldn't use it because I'm not that talented. And so we have to just recognize, like, our students are probably not as good as we were as musicians. And that's not to their discredit. It's just, it is what it is. It's our job as teachers to be able to give them the next step and to be able to recognize what their development path is.
Like, how many times have you seen a band director have killer piano player after killer piano player? It might be 10 years.
Yeah.
And then in year 11, they have a new player and they're like, I forget a voicing. Like, I never had to give a voicing in 10 years. Yeah. So you're right. Like, sometimes you just have players too. I know, going back to that, where you can talk to them about this level, but then you also have to be able to on a lower level too.
Yeah. And yeah, I think, and the efficiency thing, what Julius is talking about is, I think that you start to try to look for, like, what's just the next step for them to take? How can we get a little bit better quickly? Because you need that momentum. You don't want to build frustration into it. And honestly, I love working with younger level bands and bands that aren't quote unquote as good yet, because you can get that development happening. You can spend 2 hours in rehearsal and everybody got 10% better because that next step is 10%. You spend, as my group is fantastic, the band group, but it would take me a year for them to get 10% better because they're already so good. That 10% is a huge difference, So, it's kind of like, it's context, context.
Do you have charts that come to mind that you like to use when you have those younger bands? No, I'm putting you on the spot, and if you don't, it's okay.
I always reach out to my resources of directors. At the beginning of every August, I'm texting all of my band director people, like, what about this? What about that? I really enjoy stuff from the Kansas City Suite.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of Basie charts that are so good for teaching section playing and intonation and I mean, there's some great Ellington charts on that too, but the thing about Ellington that can be challenging is that there's always something that's so unique to the Ellington band that's written into the chart. You'll have something that's a quote unquote easy part, and then the third trombone solo will be Ledger Line City.
See, I'm not doing that one this year.
It's true. Whereas a lot of those basic charts, that look at them, you're like, oh, that's a stock arrangement, but boy, is it just right down the middle. And I love starting the year off stuff. Whatever the level of the band is, even if they're just superlative, we want them to be, let's get our fundamentals together. And that was something I really got from all those three band directors that I mentioned before, is there would always be things in the book that were just fundamental builders. But that's one of the things I'm still learning is really growing my own personal library and understanding of what's out there. And I reach out to my colleagues and friends to just get, recommendations from them, because, you spend 18 years looking at the catalogs every year, you build a library, you know what it is. I'm not there yet. I'm still working on it.
What a great lesson. Like the asking for help is strength, right? Like same thing as your high school band director, middle school band director, and you have somebody come in and work with your band, you step aside. Like, what does that show your students? Like that it's not about you.
Yeah.
It's about the learning process. And so many people think they need to know it all. Don't you find that like the younger we are, the more we think we know? And as you get older, you're like, okay, I need to ask for more and more and more help.
Yeah. I think that's one of the blessings of age, you gain that humility of yourself, and it takes you take the stress off yourself. Like, I don't have to learn all of it. I don't have to already know this. It's okay. And then you make friends with people who, it's like the old saying, like, you never want to be the best person in the band.
Yeah.
I never want to be the best band director, and I always want to be around people that, wait, so I need some phone charts, what's flat number, man? How did you know? Third trombone player, lead player, how do I deal with this? Because I want to only get that information.
So I have a question for both of you. I'll start with you. A trumpet tip that most band directors could use to help improve their trumpet section. Now, like, think of the average trumpet player, junior high school, what's something that can help their section? That's a big open-ended question.
I think I might receive some pushback from this, but don't necessarily tell your trumpet players to get their bells out of the stands. Embouchures are different. And one thing that it's not that that's not a good short-term fix. We do need to have the trumpet players have their bells out of the stands. I was telling my trumpet players today to notice the difference in the volume when other bands were playing of when the bells were down and when the bells were up. But that can mess with a young person's development of their embouchure, because if they have a natural downstream and then you tell them to bring their bell up, they might switch something on their embouchure or the placement of the trumpet, or they might start leaning back in a way that gets in their airflow. Now, you can move stands out of the way and make sure that the bells are projecting, but that thing of that can be detrimental to some players, not all.
You could have them fix their posture but not change their embouchure. Because I'm thinking of a boy in my band who, I always say, but he's literally hunched over.
If you're talking hunched over, that's one thing. Like, you want to stand up and military posture so that you can breathe. But that reflex of pull your bell up, there's not enough information in that command for the young trumpet player to know how to do that the right way. So that can lead into some bad habits developmentally. Make room for their bells to be heard. The advice I would give to young trumpet players and older trumpet players, and I tell myself all the time, is that they're not high notes above you, they're out in front of you. Don't play up. If you think about the high notes doing up, you start clenching your throat and cut off your air supply, you add tension to your body. If you think about your high notes as being out in front of you, it keeps the momentum of your air going forward. It helps you put your air through the horn as opposed to just in it. And it gets you thinking in a direction that doesn't add tension. And I learned, I got that from Conrad Herwig. He got that from his director. I just remember hearing him talk about that at a master class. I was like, keeping that one.
Mm-hmm. Say that again. Just the concept again.
Air speed.
Well, no, the high notes are not above you; they're in front of you. So if you got if low C is at the end of the bell, then C in the staff is another 5 feet beyond that. High C is at your band director's forehead. And that you're thinking about playing forward. And that gets everything moving in the right direction. It encourages it encourages air usage, air speed, and it gets you out of the thing of clenching up.
One thing I used to do when I was learning more on trumpet is I would take my fingers when they're on the keys, and then as I played higher, I kind of move the hand away from me. That's think of the away from me.
That's a great. I've heard
rather than cranking it into my face.
Yeah. you know, I heard I'm blanking on where I got all this information. But the concept of pushing the horn off of your face as you go up higher, that you use your lips to push the mouthpiece away from you. When I studied with Chris Jowdis, late great Chris Jowdis, he would talk about bringing your corners forward to get that same sort of effect. I've heard trumpet players talk about putting more lip in the mouthpiece as you go up higher. There's all these physical and mental tricks of these tiny little changes that you can make. But the main thing is like, how do I keep from, using the octave key, like jamming the horn into my face and creating.
I just love that the culture is like to help other people get better at the trumpet, right? I mean, Clark used to talk about all the time when we would meet with him about how he was always told the wrong thing when he was a kid.
Yeah.
He was always told to like grit your teeth and wiggle your ears you play, just so they didn't want you to get better than me, kind of thing. So I like how that has changed. I'm like, you don't hear that anymore, or at least I haven't.
Well, yeah, I do think the culture has changed a little bit. There's also just so much information that's available that it's kind of hard to tell people the wrong stuff. It's like, it's not as precious anymore. You're not a gatekeeper it's about encouragement. I think the role of the teacher is more about refining towards the individual. I mean, you can get a ton of information from a YouTube tutorial, but none of it is personalized. So the role of the teacher is to understand the student and be able to help them. Maybe they have all that information, but they're not figuring out how to put it together in the right way for themselves. And personally, like, I want to cultivate a good sub list of my students. That's my goal. I want to be able to get a call. Hey, can you make this gig? No. Who can you send? Oh, I got a whole list of people you haven't even heard of yet because they're my students and you can still afford them. I love sending my students on gigs. And so what I want to be able to do as a teacher is help them get to the point where they're subbing for me, because that makes me look good. Where'd you find this cat? That's my student. See, now
It's true.
So Julius, what about for you on the saxophone?
On the saxophone?
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing that I when I go into other schools, saxophone section, the biggest thing I hear is just a closed sound. So it's kind of similar in terms of what Tatum was talking about, tone wise and tone production. Because a lot of them come from the wind ensemble or concert band setting where you could have a tighter embouchure and have sound. But in jazz, this has to be way more to do that. Have to think about the U muscles, which is similar for all wind instruments, the corners, right? And wherever the corners of your mouth lie down your teeth, you want to kind of lock those down, right? And then it's about equal distribution of pressure all around your lips, but having that bottom lip be really relaxed. Because what we're trying to do is get your throat engaged, the saxophone specifically. Not so much on as much, but on the clarinet is much tighter. I'm sure when you think it's being engaged in our sound. But on saxophone, you want this to be actually doing some more. You want to feel it doing more. So that's like half the battle. So a lot of these, if they don't have the right mouthpiece, maybe it can prevent having that feeling and be too close. So, I'll show them like a high, with the octave key, I right above the staff on the saxophone and just playing it real short. I call it like a dot, maybe like so much like it on the trumpet. But that feeling of going dot, if they can't, usually what happens, they go, and it sounds like very boxy because they're biting down every time they go with some air. It's tight sound. So you want that ring or that bark in your sound. If they're doing that right, they get a bark on the high A, that means their sounds. So if I'm working with the young saxophone section, they're not even able to get that sound. It's just like tight.
Yeah.
It's tough. And then from there, just getting them to vibrate together, big on so teaching it. It goes for all the instruments because I hate hearing, beginning vibrato words like I call it the Danny. We always looked at the ball.
So when you teach it, do you teach it with air? Do you teach it with lips? Do you teach it with
a combination of everything? I don't even try to talk about the function of all the muscles at first because I could do vibrato very little movement. Sound the same. So it's different for everybody, but especially on the saxophone. I just kind of give them a feeling of this. If I put my finger on their chin, I'm just going whoa, whoa. And actually, just saying whoa, whoa, gives them the feeling of it. And they can do it with their lips. It's very minute movement. So we do quarter notes, 70 or something, of whoa. If I get to 1, 2, 3, that's good. And then that's just the beginning of it. And then to be able to turn it on, the upbeat of 4 in a certain section. Once you get that together, man, there's like a shimmer, I like to call it, in the saxophone section. So really been working on that with actually my whole brass section more lately. So, just get a unison band.
What about for you, vibrato on trumpet? Like I was always taught, don't use jaw because you can't shut it off, kind of thing. I'm not saying I agree with that, but you do something similar where you have like you're copying the sound, or
I wouldn't say it's an air thing. It's definitely more of an aperture thing. I have to admit that's not something that I've worked with to this detail, just because I didn't have the skills to do it. But now I'm learning, so I'm sitting here, I'm like taking them like, yeah, okay. I'm a huge fan of implementing vibrato. I've been lucky that most of the time I can just sort of talk with my trumpets about like put more vibrato on it. They know how to do that technically. The thing that I'm finding more and more that comes up is getting back to the idea of context. Is just like how vibrato changes depending on the style of music. You know, if you're to me, it slows down through the 20th century. Like if you're, the early stuff is real tight. You know, if you're talking about like pre-bebop, like swing jazz, man, it's a big, it's like those old newsreels. And then as you just get further into the development of the music, it slows down. And that's another thing about context. If you're playing, Maria Schneider's music, that's almost flat tones all the time, unless you happen to have a specific solo thing where you're given that leeway. A lot of Cy Johnson's arrangements for the Mingus Big Band, they're written no vibrato on that. And I'd even have him, he'd get on me sometimes. We'd play some gig at the Jazz Standard, and he'd be in the back hanging, and he'd come back, Tatum, that sounds beautiful, but it's not really looking for a flat tone there. And I'd be like, man, I'm playing lead. Man, you want to come play lead? It's like he wrote the arrangement. What am I doing? But that kind of contextual understanding, it changes a lot, and that's one of the things that we just have to be able to impart on our students, and for the students to be able to learn. But I agree wholeheartedly. That thing about putting a shimmer in your sound, or as Lon Schoenberg would say, put the time in your sound. You always talk about that. Yeah. Whatever your explanation of it is, just adding vibrations to that, it warms so much up, and it makes such a huge difference in the expressiveness of the line. And
it's teaching it more and more, like you were talking about, like, notes longer where you can put a vibrato, like you say, put the time in it. But if you can do that, you can swing just playing quarter notes.
Yep.
No 8 notes.
Yep. Because
the way you're playing that quarter note has to trick the feeling. Mm-hmm. That has to do with where's that fatness sound. So yeah, it's an interesting concept. Way deeper.
When do you have just the lead player use vibrato, like in a section, or do they always all use it?
It depends. Like we play a lot of Ellington, so there's like different times where, like the saxophone section, I call that like a lead. Usually when they're playing unison and slow, you hear, Paul Gonsalves really take. So I call that a tenor lead, even though the altos play the same part. You really want to hear the huskiness of the tenor taking the lead. So we don't usually use it. We have that, the classic open, 6 down there. We want to think about. That's when we can vibrate. And there's moments in Ellington where he always uses that sound train, not even the pieces that are just straight. He has these chords that are just like stacked on top of each other, just like, wow, what is that? And when you even try, it's a sound. And that's a lot of times we're all vibrating intensely, because that's the effect he was looking for. So yeah, it's all contextual. But sometimes with the brass, I just have to lead. But a lot of times with the saxophones, I'll have all 5.
Last random saxophone question, I promise.
Okay.
Regarding the biscuit, are you insistent that they use it at a certain development, or is it just you teach it that they use it if they want?
I always teach it from, if you're going from B flat to B, I always tell my students, don't go from B flat to using the biscuit. But I think Sonny Stitt used it like that. Dexter used it like that. So it's like, as a teacher, I was taught that way. And I think it's important. But I just did a master class with Chris Lewis, and we were both teaching the saxophones, and he could go from B flat to B almost as fast as going from then I can do with the side key. I mean, there's no way it goes fast. he really practiced. He showed them.
I just find a lot of my students struggle, like they know side key for a few years, then you
Right.
teach them, oh, we're the key of F, you might as well.
Yeah, that's true.
Then they
That is true. Then it's struggles for them to get this. I think it's good to teach. For me, I always teach the B flat B first.
Yeah.
And show them this key much later. I usually don't even teach side C. I don't. There's a lot of things. The 1 and 1 is. I never use that. But that's just me. This time, but like I said, we still watch recordings of Sonny Stitt playing. He's going from B flat to B with this.
Yeah.
So but I can't.
Thank you guys for sitting down for this conversation.
Such an
If people want to reach out to you, Tatum, how would they do that?
Find me on Instagram. Yeah, I mean, I have presence on the socials. I have a website. I have, they can find me.
You teach at Julliard, right? We didn't talk about
Yeah.
that, but heard of that before.
Yeah.
It's a place.
It's a place. It is a place. Yeah, I teach. Mostly, I'm trumpet faculty there, and then every once in a while, with the program has a rotation of band directors for a rotation of bands that is the Julliard Jazz Orchestra. It changes from concert to concert, so I'll have the privilege of being one of the directors through those rotations. I've got one going right now, so I've been working with them this month for a concert. We were working on the Shanghai Suites by Wynton Marsalis. Yeah, it's, some great music. Murder on the Woodlands.
Oh,
It's
Piccolo? I thought there was Piccolo.
I don't think there's piccolo, but like there's one. It might be. I mean, he'll do that.
Yeah.
There's one piece where there's a lot of trading that's written into. That's like one of the thematic things is just like solo trading.
Right.
And there's one where the woodwinds have to like not only trade, but they switch instruments in their trading. So like the Barry player has to take like the first trading on 4s on Barry, and then the next one on bass clarinet, and like there's a whole like it's beyond Broadway levels of choreography,
Yeah.
just in terms of the juggling of instruments for those players. They're an incredible group of students. It's a real privilege to work with. But I get to do that from time to time up there too.
We sincerely appreciate you taking your valuable time and listening to the Growing Band Director podcast. Your students are very lucky to have a band director like you. If you have any suggestions for episode topics or think you have an area of expertise to share on a show with us, please reach out. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to help spread the word, please give us a 5-star review and tell your band director friends to subscribe as well. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, our YouTube channel, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening to The Growing Band Director. See you next week.